here this morning. It's good to be back in Georgia. I've been in North Carolina all week long and explored almost all of that state in my time in North Carolina. So I told them, I said, well, y'all gave me the grand tour for sure. I was up there training a guy, and so I drove up Sunday night and spent the night, and we went all over. We went everywhere. I saw all kinds of places, and we didn't get home till about, what was that, 8 o'clock last night? I think we got home at 8 o'clock last night, so I'm just glad to be home. And hopefully I think with my schedule, maybe by Wednesday I'll get to take a deep breath, but until then I'm still wide open. But anyway, good to be in church this morning. Good to see everyone. We are going to do something just a touch different this morning. Just a touch different. It actually still applies to what we've been doing, and we'll get there, but we're going to start in 1 Samuel. We're going to start in 1 Samuel this morning. And Brother Croft already had his Bible open back there. He's like, I know right where he's going to be, but instead I threw him for a loop by going to 1 Samuel chapter number 28. 1 Samuel chapter number 28. And I actually said it last week. We mentioned what we're going to be talking about this morning. We mentioned it last week, and I just thought about it this week. We were in church. Thursday night, Friday night, and then yesterday morning up at a meeting that a lot of the people from church here had actually went up to the meeting up there, and it was a real good meeting, everything. And but it was just something that got touched on a few times, and I still had it on my mind from last week in Sunday school, and so I just thought, this morning that I would touch on it again this morning, and then we'll move on to the last few kings before they go into captivity. Lord willing, we'll do that next week. But in 1 Samuel chapter number 28, what we're going to be talking about this morning is and again, we talked about it last week with Josiah, was Josiah put on a disguise. And then I've just been thinking about that this week. I thought about disguises, and then I looked it up. I think my wife may even saw me looking it up in church. In church yesterday, I was trying to look in the concordance in my Bible about disguises, and I didn't want to get my phone out and look it up because, it looks bad when you got your phone out in church looking something up because they think you're playing on your phone. But I was just going through my concordance in my Bible, and I was like, let me see what this is. And it's funny, and then I actually, once I got home, I got my real concordance out. And most of the time that disguised is mentioned in the Bible, it's mentioned throughout. It's basically it's mentioned throughout the kings right here. So starting with Saul and then ending in Josiah, that is the only time disguised is mentioned throughout the Bible. And so now we know that there are other times where other people disguised themselves. Jacob disguised himself whenever he was going in to his father and to Isaac. He disguised himself and made himself out like he was Esau. There are other times, but the word disguised is not actually in there. But we know that there are other times. And so one of the things I don't want to say is, and I may accidentally say it this morning, but I try to be careful because I try not to say, hey, every time you see the word, disguised, it has a bad context. I don't want to say that, but I might. But anyway, but most of the time when someone is disguising themselves, it's because there's a problem. Most of the time when someone is disguising themselves, there is something wrong. There's a reason why they're not going as who they actually are. And so I've been, like I said, Josiah did it, and when Josiah does it, which we'll get to it eventually, Josiah did it one time, and that one time cost him his life. And so, but we're going to look at these. We're going to look at 4 different passages, and I even thought about it. I'm like, I'm teaching the old, the adult Sunday school class here. I mean, I'm teaching the older adult Sunday school class. I'm like, but then what we're going to notice here is every one of these people, everyone, 1 Samuel chapter 28, Brother Parks, 1 Samuel 28. Every one of these people, this was actually at the end of their life. You think about someone being deceptive or someone, using a disguise. You think about it with someone who would do it as a younger person. But what we're going to see is that these people were later in life. And again, a lot of times you're in a class like this and you're like, hey, I'm gonna teach on something right here, and you're like, I don't even know I'm teaching on that. I'm teaching, I'm teaching to the choir right here. These guys already know all this stuff. They already know all this stuff. They've had this stuff nailed down before I was ever born. They've had this stuff nailed down before I was ever born. So it's ridiculous to teach on this stuff. But like I said, this is what was on my heart. So this is what we're going to go over this morning, and we'll get back to what we have been teaching on next week. So 1 Samuel chapter number 28. Verse number 3, it says, Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, even in his own city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and wizards out of the land. And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. And when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by the prophets. Then said Saul unto his servants, Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said to him, Behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. And Saul disguised himself and put on other raiment, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. And the woman said unto him, Behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done, how he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits, and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die? And Saul sware to her by the Lord, saying, As the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. Then said the woman, Whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, Bring me up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice. And the woman spake to Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. And so again, right here, so we have Saul, and we know what happened. We know how that God told Samuel to go and tell Saul that he had rejected him, and that he was going to replace him with, for those of you who were at the meeting last week, someone better than him. And so here is Saul, and he depended on Samuel and depended on Samuel and depended on Samuel, but now Samuel's gone. That's why we read that verse. It said that Samuel had died, and now here Saul faces the first major issue he's facing with Samuel dead, and he faces those Philistines. And give him some credit, because he didn't go straight to the familiar spirit. He did try to inquire of the Lord, but God wasn't speaking to him anymore. God wasn't speaking to him anymore. God had rejected him, and it was his fault that God had rejected him. It was his disobedience that caused God to reject him. And so, but here we have him, and he goes and he tries to inquire, and it says that he tried to inquire of the Lord, but God wouldn't hear. He tried the Urim and the Thummim, and he tried the prophets, and they're like, got nothing for you. I got nothing for you, and so I can't tell you what's going on. And so this passage right here in verse number 3, it says, and Saul had put away those. So there was a time, Chris, in Saul's life where he was trying to do right. There was a time when he was trying to do right, and he made a decree and said, hey, I want to do away with all of this. I want to do away with all this, and we're not going to do this anymore. And then there comes another time in his life where he's like, hey, that thing that I did away with, well, I need to bring that back. But number one, all the people of the land were like, hey, even this witch, even her, she's like, hey, you know what Saul said, don't you? Y'all are going to get me in trouble. Y'all are going to get me in trouble. But here is Saul, and the thing that he put away is the thing that now he's like, hey, I want to do that again. And have you ever noticed, like, people, there are a lot of times where people, while we were up there at the meeting, the preachers, a lot of the preaching was preaching to young people. And you understand that when you're preaching to young people, you're trying to warn young people, you're trying to warn them of the dangers, that the devil's got all kinds of traps and snares out there for them. But, he doesn't just have traps for young people, he has traps for old people. He has traps and snares for old people. There are snares out there for, Brother West. There are snares out there for Brother Tyrone, for Brother Parks. And we should be wise. We should be much wiser to them. But it's a shame for someone in their old age to fall as much as it is a shame for someone in their young age to fall. Because, we've been warned and warned and warned, and we've sat back and watched, and we've seen other people fall, and we should understand and know the traps and the snares. And so I got to thinking about this, how if you have to hide to do something, if you're hiding yourself to do something, you already know in your heart what I'm doing is not right. If you have to hide, if you have to go and sneak around and do something so that your parents, a couple of my kids are up in the balcony, so that your parents don't know what you're doing, guess what? You're not doing right. Just period. As soon as the thought comes in your heart, hey, I need to go sneak around and hide so they don't know I'm doing this, guess what? You're doing wrong. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter what it is in your heart. If you say, hey, I don't want my mom and dad to know, or I don't want my wife to know, or I don't want my husband to know, I don't want this person, I don't want my preacher to know. If that is what's coming into your heart, you should know immediately, hey, this thing that I'm about to do is not right. And again, like I said, it's not just young people. This is Saul. This is Saul in his old age. He's not going to be around that much longer. He's not going to be around that much longer. This is not, like I said, when I started going through this, I'm like, I teach the adult Sunday school class. I don't teach the young people Sunday school class. But then I got to noticing every one of these people we're going to look at, it was the end of their life. The end of their life. And again, when you run a race, you want to run the race, but you want to finish the race, and you want to finish the race, good. And so some people start out really well, but then they don't finish. And why run a race if you're not going to finish? And why start out really good if you're just going to crash in the end? And so we have to be careful. We have to be careful, because the devil's still out to get us. He's still out to get every one of us. Why? Because, most of y'all in here have grandkids. And maybe your grandkids are watching you. And me and Chris don't have grandkids yet. My wife doesn't have a grandchild yet. But your grandkids are watching. And sometimes, Brother Parks, you are the one thing that's between that kind of either it's going to point them to God, or they're going to say, you know what, I don't want to have anything to do with God. I don't want to have anything to do with God because my papa, my mama, my whatever, grandma, granddad, whatever you want to call it, they were in church all these years and did all this stuff, but right there at the end, do you know what they did? And it was so terrible. And it's it's terrible to see older people fall. So here Saul is an old man, and what is he doing? He's going back to something that he had said, hey, we're not doing this anymore. And he knew, hey, I just can't go do this. I just can't go do this And so, because I just can't go do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to disguise myself. And, you know, sometimes you hear it. You don't hear much preaching on television anymore. You don't hear much preaching on going to the movies anymore. But you ever seen someone that they preached against going to the movies, and then you drive by and whoop, out they come from a movie theater, and you're like, what in the world? What in the world are you doing? And so, but sometimes they try and hide themselves. You ever? I'm sure all of us have seen someone in town, and it's funny how God works that out sometimes, where you see someone in town and they're not dressed the way that they should be. And what do? The first thing they do, they try and hide themselves. They hope to see you first. And my thoughts always, you came to town that way. If you came to town that way, you should expect in a town that you're going to see. It's funny, the last 2 times I've been out of town, the last time we went out of town, me and my wife, I think I told y'all, me and my wife were coming back from Ohio, and the Morrisons were coming back from Pennsylvania, and we both met in Knoxville. We were at the same place at the same time. He sent me a picture to let me know he was at a place. I sent him a picture back letting him know I was at the place. Turned out we were at the same place. He was just inside and I was sitting on the outside. And this time we were in North Carolina, and we all left at different times, and we're riding down the road. We're riding through Chris's neck of the woods. Chris, we're riding right down through close to Murphy. We're riding through right there where the rapids are, and I look in my mirror and I'm like, that looks like the Sutherland's Suburban right there behind my wife, because it was me and my van and then my wife, and then I'm like, that looks like, and I'm riding, and the road's real curvy, and every time I run around the curve, I look back in the mirror, I'm like, I'm pretty sure that's the Sutherland's. Finally, Adriana calls, she's like, do you see it's the Sutherland's behind us? And so, it's funny, we're in Murphy, North Carolina, and here's someone you know. And so you just never know. You never know when you're going to run into somebody. And so Saul said, hey, look, I'm going to disguise myself because, I can't let it be known. I can't let it be known that I'm going to see this witch. I need it to be private. I need it to be private because I'm the one who said, hey, we're not going to do this anymore. Hey, we're not going to do this anymore. Hey, we're doing away with all these people. And now that I'm in a bad situation, I'm in a turmoil, and because I'm in this turmoil, I don't have my preacher that I can go back to because I destroyed the relationship with my preacher. How many people have you seen? That they do something to destroy the relationship with their preacher? They destroy that relationship, and then something comes up in their life, and when that thing comes up in their life, they really need that preacher again. They need that relationship again, but it's gone. We understand that Samuel was dead, but we understand that God had rejected Saul, and so that relationship was gone, and God didn't send someone in to fill that void. God did not send someone new in to fill that void for Saul. And so here he is with that void, and it comes to a place in his life where he needs a preacher, but he destroyed that relationship with that man of God, and that man of God is gone now, and he's like, hey, I got nobody. And so how many times do people fall back when they truly just needed to get right with God? They truly just needed to just get right with God, and again, in Saul's case, he couldn't, but restore that fellowship with that preacher. But because they didn't, they fall back on stuff. Sometimes, Chris, it's someone that's in church. It's in church. They're in church for years and 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 years. And something major comes up in their life, and they run out and go grab them a bottle, or they go get into drugs again, or they go get into something again. And you're like, what in the world? What in the world? How have you been in church this long? And this thing, and I understand sometimes things shake you. They shake you to your core. But it's not time to run back to the bottle. Can you imagine, brother? Can you imagine if we ride through town? If you ride through town today, and one of the people that you know and that you went to church with, and you see them sneaking out of the liquor store, because they do. They're not going to the liquor store in Calhoun. They're going to the liquor store in Rome. They're going to the liquor store down in Cartersville somewhere and trying to sneak in there and grab them something and sneak it back out. Again, if you need to disguise yourself, you're not doing right. If you're trying to hide it, you're not doing right. If you can't do it in front of your family, if you can't do it in front of your wife, if you can't do it in front of your kids, if you're and so I know this is the older class, but if your wife can't pick up your cell phone and look at everything you put on your cell phone, everything you got, every text message you got, anything you've looked at online, if your wife can't do that, guess what? You're looking at something you're not supposed to be looking at. Just that simple. It's just that simple. If your husband can't pick up your phone and look at your phone and see who you've been talking to, again, and it's crazy. I think I told y'all about, I may have told y'all, but I worked with this guy. He worked with me. He was from Knoxville. And he told me, he said, yeah, my wife's mad at me. I'm like, yeah? He said, yeah. He said, I've been on Facebook. And he said, I found my old high school sweetheart. I said, you're stupid. And he looked at me. He said, I'm not even done talking. I said, I already told you you're stupid. I said, you don't even have to keep talking. I said, you're married. This woman has delivered 3 or 4 of your kids, however many kids you've got. She's delivered these kids, and she doesn't look, because you're almost 60 years old, she doesn't look like she did when you're 20. But in your mind, this person you're talking to, she still looks like she did whenever she was 16. I'm like, you should. He's like, well, you sound just like her. And that was a little bit of impression how he used to talk. But anyway, I'm like, well, you know what? It's because she's right. I'm like, I don't even know what you're thinking. Why would you even start having a conversation with this woman? All you have are these fond memories, and yes, you broke up, yes, you married this other woman, but you've been through 40 years of life with this other woman, ups and downs, and all you have are these fond memories of your childhood with this other woman. All you're asking for is a heartache. But how many people, when Facebook first come out, how many people did you see they'd leave their wife or their husband, and they would go to their old high school sweetheart that they broke up with 30 years ago, and you're like, I thought you were too old to do something that dumb. But they weren't. And so here is Saul, and he does something that he said, hey, doing away with the familiar spirits. And then next thing you know, he's like, hey, look, I'm in trouble. And again, sometimes we get in trouble. But we have to be careful, because just because we're in trouble doesn't mean it's time to go back and start doing the things we used to do. It's like, hey, I'm in trouble financially. Oh, I know how I can make me some quick money. I can make me some quick cash. All I got to do is sell a little drugs, or, do a little bit of this, or do a little bit of that. I can do something just a little bit shady, and not ever even concern yourself with, hey, I've got a testimony. I've got a testimony. I've got a testimony to my church. I've got testimony to my kids. I've got testimony to my grandkids. I've got testimony to my family. I've got testimony to all these people. And you know how they are. I mean, they're just waiting. If you got family that's not in church, Brother Croft, they're just waiting. They're on the tip of their tongue, and they hope they can say at any moment, I thought you were a Christian. I can't believe I saw you do that. I mean, after all the grief that you gave us for all the time that your wife was always going to wear a dress, and then I see you and your wife and your daughter in town and they all got pants on, I can't believe that. And they go away satisfied, they go away gloating, they go away patting themselves on the back, because they're like, I knew it all along. And it's your fault. It's your fault. And again, like I said, we used to go to Dollywood. We used to go to Dollywood a lot years ago, and you'd see some people in Dollywood, and they didn't want to see you. They didn't want to see you. They run for cover. Why? Because they weren't dressed how, when they were in the pulpit, how they said, their family dressed. They weren't dressed how you would expect them to be dressed. And they come walking up through there and you'd see them make a U-turn. They'd make a U-turn. Why? Because they saw you at the same time you saw them, but they hoped that you didn't see them. And so hey, we'll just make a little U-turn here. We'll go somewhere else. Dollywood's a big park. Maybe they won't see us anymore. But you know how it is. And some people, then you're like, hey, now I'm on a mission. Now I'm going to go find them. Now I'm going to be like, hey, brother, good to see you. Good to see you, sir. It's a shame. But people do things and they disguise themselves. They're like, hey, I'll disguise myself and I'll be able to go do the things that I said, hey, we're not doing anymore. I'll be able to go do the things that I said, hey, this is not, we're not allowed to do this. Hey, I'll go do the things that everyone knows shouldn't be done. But that's what I'm going to go do. If you turn in your Bible to 1 Kings chapter number 14, 1 Kings chapter number 14, in verse number 1, it says, at that time Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, fell sick. You know what? Hang on. All right. Go back to the previous chapter, 2 verses. Verse number 33. After this thing, Jeroboam returned not from his evil way, but made again of the lowest of the people priests, of the highest places, whosoever would be consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. And this thing became sin unto the house of Jeroboam, even to cut it off, and to destroy it from off the face of the earth. At that time, Abijah, the son of Jeroboam, fell sick. And Jeroboam said to his wife, arise, I pray thee, and disguise thyself, that thou be not known to be the wife of Jeroboam, and get thee to Shiloh. Behold, there is Ahijah the prophet, which told me that I should be king over this people. And take with thee 10 loaves and cracknels and a cruse of honey, and go to him. He shall tell thee what shall become of the child. And Jeroboam's wife did so, and arose and went to Shiloh, and came to the house of Ahijah. And Ahijah could not see, for his eyes were set by reason of his age. And the Lord said unto Ahijah, behold, the wife of Jeroboam cometh to ask a thing for thee for her son, for he is sick. Thus and thus shalt thou say unto her, for it shall be when she cometh in that she shall feign herself to be another woman. And it was so, when Ahijah heard the sound of her feet, as she came in at the door, that he said, come in, thou wife of Jeroboam, why feignest thou thyself to be another? For I am sent to thee with heavy tidings. So again, here's Jeroboam. Here's Jeroboam, and he's done wrong. Again, we know that he set up those golden calves, and God said, hey, there's going to come a day in the previous chapter, actually in the chapter that we were reading at the start, right there, chapter 13. God actually sends a prophet to prophesy that one day Josiah is going to come, and he's going to take away those altars. And so here, instead of Jeroboam getting right with God, he doubles down on it. And so that relationship with God is destroyed. And so he's like, and so then what happens? A trial comes in his life. I mean, you're going to see this over and over, that it's when the trials come, you're like, hey, I need something from God. But that relationship with the men of God has been destroyed. That relationship is destroyed between them and God. And so they're like, hey, I'm going to have to do something right here. So what he says right here, he says, hey, he's not going to do it himself. But now he said, I want my wife to disguise herself. I want my wife to disguise herself. So now, here, this relationship is destroyed, and he's like, hey, I know what we'll do. We'll go ask the old preacher. We'll go ask the old preacher, because at one time, he gave me some good news, because he's the one that told me, hey, you're going to be the king. And so, but I want you to disguise yourself. What was the purpose of her disguising herself? Well, what was the purpose? Well, I mean, what was the purpose, Brother Parks? Again, especially the fact that God tells this old man of God, that God's going to tell this old man of God who it is. But we read it right there. It says in verse number 4, but Ahijah could not see. He wouldn't have known who she was anyway. There was no reason for her to disguise herself. He couldn't see anymore. He was blind, he was old, and he couldn't see. I don't know if his eyes were covered over with cataracts or what, but he could not see. But Jeroboam was like, hey, I need you to go. I need you to go to the man of God, but I need you to disguise yourself, and then we're going to make up this big elaborate story. We're going to make up this big elaborate story that you're going to tell him, because I really want my son to be healed, but I don't want you to tell him, that he's talking about Jeroboam. And so again, these relationships are important that you have with the man of God, with the men of God. These relationships are important because those relationships get destroyed, and now you're sending a mediator. Now you have to send a mediator because you're too ashamed to come yourself, because if you come yourself, what he's going to say is you need to get right with God. So he tried to send a mediator, but not only did he try and send a mediator, he tried to send her at feigning to be someone else, just asking for a friend. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like, hey, and you're like, you have someone come up to you and you talk to you and you're like, hey, you just need to talk to the preacher about this. I can't talk to the preacher. I can't talk to the preacher. Well, just go tell the preacher that there's a certain person, and you're like, look, I'm not doing that. I'm not going and saying a certain person. Look, you just need to go back and just humble yourself and repent, and then tell the preacher, hey, I messed up, I made a mistake, I'm sorry, but this is a situation. Do you think God will do something for us? But that's not what Jeroboam did. He didn't want to humble himself. He didn't want to repent. So he said, hey, I know what I'll do. We'll trick the preacher. We'll trick him. We'll disguise my wife, and she'll go like she's not really the one, even though she brings all this stuff. He's like, well, I mean, apparently she must be wealthy because she's bringing all this stuff. But he said, I'll disguise my wife, and when I disguise her, he won't know who she is. And God said, no, here's that old man of God, and he's sitting there, and you know how it is. He's this old man of God, and he's probably sitting there thinking, God may not speak to me anymore. I'm about to pass off the scene. And then one more time, God says, hey, Ahijah, I got something for you to do. Here comes Jeroboam's wife, and she's going to act like she's someone else. But I want you to tell her, and this is what I want you to tell her. And it's going to be pretty rough what he's going to tell her. But as soon as she comes and she knocks on the door, she comes and he hears the sound of her feet, and he's like, come on in. Come on in. I know exactly who you are. Come on in. And she didn't even get to use the disguise that she had. She had to come in looking like, but again, he couldn't see her anyway. But God said, no, I'm not going to let her deceive that man of God. I'm not going to let her deceive that man of God by pretending she's something she's not. I'm going to show that man of God exactly who she is, and you can put all the disguise on you want to. And again, we've all been in church. We've all seen people. I mean, sometimes you see someone throughout the week, whether you work with them or something like that, and then they come to church and you're like, where was that person all week long? I don't even know who that person is. I don't even recognize that person right there. And so they're putting on a deceptive face. They're trying to act like they're spiritual when they're not. They're trying to put on something. They're trying to put on a show for the man of God. But guess what? God shows the man of God who we are. He shows the man of God who we are. And so here God said, hey, look, I'm not going to let her deceive him. He's old, he can't see, and I am going to say, no, we're not going to do it this way. And so I'm going to go tell that man of God, hey, this is who's coming, and she's got a question for you, and you're going to tell her, and it's not going to be good. Why? Because her husband refused, when he had an opportunity, he refused to get right with God. And because he refused to get right with God, now she's going to suffer, and her son's going to suffer because of it. And so, again, like I said, we have to be careful. We have to be careful about the relationship we have with that man of God, and that when God is dealing with us, we don't reject God, and then whenever something troubling comes up in our life, which it's going to, it's going to come up in all our lives. Things are going to come up, and now you're like, hey, I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place because I really need to answer to know whether, this thing's going to turn out good, but I can't go to that man of God because if I go to that man of God, he's going to say, hey, probably the first thing you ought to do is just get right with God. That's probably the first thing you ought to do. Before we start talking about anything else, well, you need to get right with God. And Jeroboam said, well, I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't have to deal with that, so I'll send my wife. And not only when I'll send my wife, I don't want her to tell him that you're Jeroboam's wife, because if I send her up there and she says, hey, I'm Jeroboam's wife, he's going to say, hey, you go back and tell Jeroboam that he's done wicked and that he needs to get right with God. In 1 Kings chapter number 22, this right here in 1 Kings chapter number 22, in verse number 3. In verse number 3, it says, and the king of Israel said unto his servants, know ye that Ramoth in Gilead is ours, and we be still, and take it not out of the hand of the king of Syria. And he said unto Jehoshaphat, wilt thou go with me to battle to Ramoth Gilead? Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, I am as thou art, my people as thy people, my horses as thy horses. Again, we taught on that a while back. And Jehoshaphat said unto the king of Israel, inquire, I pray thee, at the word of the Lord today. Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together. I'll skip over that. We know what the prophets said. They said, yeah, it's going to be great. And Jehoshaphat said, is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides, that we might inquire of him? And the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man, Micaiah, the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, for he doth not prophesy good concerning me, but evil. And Jehoshaphat said, let not the king say so. And let me skip down to verse 13. It says, and the messengers that were gone to call Micaiah spake unto him, saying, behold, now the words of the prophet declare good unto the king with one mouth. Let thy word, I pray thee, be like the word of one of them, and speak that which is good. And Micaiah said, as the Lord liveth, what the Lord saith unto me, I will speak. So he came to the king, and the king said unto him, Micaiah, shall we go up against Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall we forbear? And he answered him, go and prosper, for the Lord shall deliver it in the hand of the king. And the king said unto him, how many times shall I adjure thee, that thou tell me nothing but that which is true in the name of the Lord? And again, he didn't want to hear what he's about to say. And he said, I saw all Israel scattered upon the hills as sheep that have not a shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let them return every man to his house in peace. And the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, did I not tell thee that he would prophesy no good concerning me, but evil? And so we'll skip down right here, and in verse number 27 it says, and say, thus saith the king, put this fellow in the prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and with water of affliction until I come in peace. So again, he's like, hey, you put him in prison. And Micaiah's like, look, I'm not changing. You can put me in there, but look what he says right here. And Micaiah said, if thou return at all in peace, the Lord hath not spoken by me, and he said, hearken, O people, every one of you. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, went up to Ramoth Gilead. So even though Micaiah said, hey, look, it's not going to end well for you. All those other prophets said, hey, it'll be just fine. So here, look at what he does. He actually sets up his friend. He sets up his supposed friend. Again, I don't think Jehoshaphat should have been playing nice with Ahab, but he was. But in verse number 30, he says, and the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, I will disguise myself. I will disguise myself and enter into the battle, but put thou on thy robes. And the king of Israel disguised himself and went into the battle. Look what happens. But the king of Syria commanded his 32 captains that had rule over his chariots, saying, Fight neither small nor great, save only with the king of Israel. And it came to pass when the captains of the chariots saw Jehoshaphat. Again, why did they find Jehoshaphat? Because the king of Syria said, hey, we're not fighting with the army, we're not fighting with the little people, we're out to get one man. We want Ahab. And Ahab said, hey, you know what? They probably know who I am. They're probably looking for the guy out there with his robes on. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to disguise myself, and I'm just going to fight like I'm just a regular, ordinary private in the army here. But you go ahead and wear your robes. You wear your robes. And sometimes, and so we know that they realize, after they almost kill him, they realize, oh, wait a second, that's not Ahab, that's Jehoshaphat. And we know that the guy takes a bow at a venture and just shoots an arrow up in the air and boom, hits Ahab. Why? Because that man of God said, hey, we're going to take, God is going to take you out. God's going to take you out. And so, but think about this. I mean, here's Ahab, and he knew that he was doing something he was not supposed to do. But what did he do? He disguised himself, and in the process, he set up his friend. You ever done something you're not supposed to do, that God told you not to do, and you may not be the one that get in trouble, but you set your friend up for failure? You set your friend up. It's your friend that gets taken down. It's your friend that gets taken out. It's your friend that's the one that ends up in trouble. And you walk off, and sometimes you walk off like you're scot-free, and then they're the ones dealing with the consequences. And a lot of times you're like, I don't even know what they're talking about. Ahab, had Jehoshaphat been killed and not Ahab would have went to his house just happy as can be. Wouldn't have bothered him a bit. He'd have slept just fine that night. And you have to be careful with your friends, the friends that you're hanging out with, when you realize, hey, wait a second. I mean, Jehoshaphat should have known. Micaiah already said, first of all, he heard those other prophets, and those other prophets said, hey, you know what? You're all good. And they say, hey, come on, man. I mean, these guys aren't prophets. Find me a real one. And here comes Micaiah, and Micaiah tells them what's going to happen. And Jehoshaphat said, oh, you know what? I'll go anyway. And so you better be careful when you know Jehoshaphat knew better. And he went anyway, and he went along with the plan. And again, sometimes I don't think it's intentional, but sometimes you're just going along to get along. Sometimes you just go along to get along. And because you go along to get along, what happens is you get yourself in trouble. And that friend you thought was a friend, they're over there hiding out like they're part of the army, and they've set you up for failure. They've set you up for failure. And they're going to go home. If something happens to you and not them, they're going to be happy as a lark. And you can point fingers all you want to and say, well, it was so-and-so, and I was only there because of so-and-so. But guess what? You were there. You were there. And the last thing, I'm trying to hurry right here, the last thing we'll look at is chapter number 35. And I mentioned it last week in chapter 2 Chronicles, chapter 35, verse number 20. After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by Euphrates, and Josiah went out against him. But he sent ambassadors to him, saying, what have I to do with thee, thou king of Judah? I come not against thee this day, but against the house wherewith I have war, for God commanded me to make haste. Forbear thee from meddling with God, who is with me, that he destroy thee not. Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself that he might fight with him, and hearkened not unto the words of Necho from the mouth of God, and came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. And the archers shot at King Josiah. Now they did not know they were shooting at King Josiah. And the king said to his servants, have me away, for I'm sore wounded. We know that he dies. And again, I mentioned this last week. I mentioned that with Josiah right here, Josiah is only 39 years old. He's only 39 years old. He should have had years and years and years of life to live. He chose to disobey the voice one time. One time. He chose one time. He wasn't like Manasseh, who continually did wicked. He wasn't like his father, Ammon, who was wicked, but God only gave Ammon 2 years. But here is Josiah, and it says that Necho's words were from the mouth of God. He doesn't go to the man of God. He doesn't go to Jeremiah. He doesn't go to any other and say, hey, look, should I get in this battle? He chose to disobey one time, and he disguised himself to do it. Again, if you have to hide yourself, if you have to disguise yourself, even when you're Josiah, who was a good king, who did more to reform Judah than any king before him had done, God said, hey, not going to let you do that. And again, you may say, hey, and I'll partially agree with you, that God said, hey, look, I'm going to have to take Josiah off the scene because these people are so wicked. They've acted like they've got right with God, but they haven't got right with God, so I'm going to have to take Josiah off the scene. If you want to tell me that, that's fine, and I'll partially agree with you. But God could have took him out another way. God could have taken him out another way and not have this blot on Josiah that is, hey, this word came from the mouth of God. Now again, sometimes we don't like who the messenger is. Sometimes you just don't like who the messenger is. But you better be careful when you get a message and say, you know what, I don't really care for that person. But if that message was for me, God didn't say, hey, look, I'm going to spare Josiah because it was Necho that said it, and in Josiah's mind, he's like, there's no way Necho can know God. God didn't spare Josiah. And honestly, I believe, had Josiah not disguised himself, I believe that Necho said, don't you shoot at the king. I don't have a fight with him. I don't understand why he's got a fight with me. I've sent ambassadors down there, but he seems like he's going to come anyway. But don't shoot at the king. And Josiah knew that, and because he knew that, he said, hey, I'm going to disguise myself. And in the process of disguising himself, it cost him his life. So we have to be careful. We have to be, anytime that temptation comes to do something, they're like, I'm going to have, I hope no one from Concord sees me while I'm doing this. I hope no one from church sees me while I'm doing this. I hope no one that I know, I hope I don't, walk in and see someone, someone that I know. If you have that thought, the best thing for you to do is say, we're just not doing this. Just not going to do it. Whatever it is. I hope my wife doesn't catch me. I hope my husband doesn't see me doing this. If that's your thought right there, best thing not to do it. Thank you.